The city of Silveridge was a place of steel, glass, and relentless ambition, a stark contrast to the quiet, dusty plains of Kansas where Arya Vance had grown up. In Kansas, the silence was heavy with the weight of things left unsaid, specifically the sounds of her father's volatile temper echoing through their farmhouse. Arya had spent her youth shielding her mother from the fallout of his bad days, learning to read the tension in his jaw like a weather vane. When she finally moved to Silveridge to open her boutique architectural firm, she promised herself she would only build structures that were solid, transparent, and safe. One evening, while seeking a moment of respite on the terrace of her high-rise, she met Kalen Thorne. Kalen was a neurosurgeon whose reputation for brilliance was only matched by his reputation for being emotionally unreachable. He was striking with an intensity that felt like a physical weight. That night, they traded naked truths, raw, unfiltered admissions that people usually hid behind polite smiles. Kalen admitted he was a man of logic, not emotion. Arya admitted she was a woman who was tired of being strong. There was an immediate, kinetic connection between them, a spark that felt dangerous and inevitable. However, Arya's heart was already a map of old scars, and the most prominent one belonged to Leo Sterling. Years ago, Leo had been a discarded soul, a homeless boy hiding in the garage of her childhood home. Arya had been his lifeline, sneaking him food and blankets, finding in him a kindred spirit who understood what it meant to want to disappear. Their teenage love was a desperate, beautiful secret until her father discovered them. The night ended in a horrific display of violence that forced Leo to flee, leaving Arya with a hollow ache and a promise that they would find each other again when they were no longer victims of the wind. As Arya's relationship with Kalen deepened, she felt she had finally escaped her past. Kalen was everything her father wasn't: successful, controlled, and adored by the public. But the control was a double-edged sword. The first time Kalen's temper flared, it was a blur of movement, a shattered glass, a pushed shoulder. He was immediately devastated, falling to his knees and begging for forgiveness, citing the immense pressure of his surgical career and a childhood trauma he had never processed. Arya, conditioned by years of watching her mother forgive the unforgivable, saw his tears and felt a familiar, treacherous empathy. She chose to believe it was an isolated incident. Then the past collided with the present. Arya walked into a trendy new bistro in the heart of Silveridge and found Leo Sterling behind the counter. He was no longer the starving boy. He was a renowned chef with a steady gaze and a quiet confidence. The reunion was bittersweet. Leo saw the way Arya flinched when a door slammed. He saw the subtle way she deferred to Kalen. He knew the signs of a woman living in a state of high alert. His presence became a silent anchor for her, a reminder of a version of herself that didn't have to apologize for existing. The tension escalated when Kalen discovered an old photograph of Leo tucked inside one of Arya's journals. The discovery acted as a catalyst, stripping away Kalen's polished exterior and revealing a possessive, terrifying rage. In a heated confrontation in their kitchen, Kalen's hands became weapons once more. This time, there was no hiding the bruises. Arya lay on the floor, the cold tile against her face, and realized with a sickening jolt of clarity that she had designed a life that was nothing more than a more expensive version of her mother's prison. She was no longer just an architect of buildings. She was the architect of her own destruction if she didn't find a way out. The months following the confrontation were a labyrinth of fear and resolve. Arya discovered she was pregnant, a realization that felt like both a blessing and a death sentence. She knew that Kalen would use the child as the ultimate tether to keep her bound to him. She moved into a small, secure studio on the other side of the city, cutting off contact and immersing herself in her work. But Kalen was relentless. He didn't use threats. He used the language of healing. He sent letters detailing his therapy sessions. He left messages crying about how the thought of his child growing up without him was breaking his soul. Leo remained a constant, quiet support. He didn't push for a relationship. He simply showed up. He brought her meals when she forgot to eat and sat with her in the park, talking about nothing and everything. He was the what if that she wasn't ready to answer yet. Arya knew she couldn't use Leo as an escape hatch. If she was going to leave Kaelin, it had to be for her own sake, and for the sake of the life growing inside her. She spent her nights studying the patterns of domestic cycles, realizing that the most dangerous part of the cycle was the honeymoon phase, the part where the abuser convinced the victim that things would be different this time. When Arya's daughter, Lyra, was born, the world seemed to stop spinning. Kaelin was permitted to be in the room, and for an hour, the three of them looked like the quintessential happy family. Kaelin held Lyra with such tenderness that Arya felt her resolve wavering. He looked at her and whispered that they could start over, that this little girl deserved a whole family. It was the moment Arya had been dreading, the moment where her heart wanted to say yes, even though her brain was screaming no. In that hospital room, Arya looked at Lyra's tiny, perfect hands. She thought about the first time she saw her father hit her mother. She thought about the first time Kaelin hit her. She realized that if she stayed, Lyra's first memory of love would be a lie. Lyra would grow up watching her mother diminish herself to keep the peace. She would learn that love was something you had to survive, rather than something that nourished you. Arya looked at Kaelin, not with hatred, but with a profound, final sadness. She told him that she loved the man he could be, but she could no longer live with the man he was. The divorce was a slow, agonizing process. Kaelin fought her at every turn, alternating between desperate pleas and legal maneuvering. But Arya remained unshakable. She had finally learned that breaking a cycle required more than just leaving. It required a total refusal to accept the narrative that she was responsible for his choices. She built a new life in Silveridge, one where the walls were thick enough to provide true safety. Her firm began to specialize in community spaces, places designed for healing and connection. Years later, Arya stood on the balcony of her new home, watching a 5-year-old Lyra run through the grass with Leo's dog. Leo was there, too, folding laundry and talking about a new menu he was designing. There was no grand, cinematic ending. There was just the quiet, hard-won piece of a woman who had decided that the legacy of pain stopped with her. She had learned that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away from the person you love to protect the person you are becoming. The cycle was broken, and for the first time in her life, Arya Vance was finally home. The skyline of Silveridge was a jagged promise of progress, but for Arya, it felt more like a cage of mirrors reflecting her own mistakes. The birth of her daughter, Lyra, had fundamentally shifted the gravity of her world. In the weeks following the delivery, Arya remained in her secluded studio, a space she had designed to be as minimalist and uncluttered as her mind was chaotic. Every morning, the sun would cut across the polished concrete floors, reminding her that she was no longer living in the shadows of the farmhouse in Kansas, nor in the opulent, high-tension penthouse she had shared with Kaelin. Kaelin's presence during those early months was a calculated campaign of contrition. He didn't storm her door. Instead, he weaponized his absence. He sent handmade wooden toys for Lyra, intricately carved and smelling of cedar. He sent medical journals with highlighted passages about the importance of paternal bonding. His messages were masterpieces of emotional precision. I am doing the work, Arya. I am unlearning the darkness. I just want to be the man you and Lyra deserve. For a woman who had spent her entire life trying to fix the broken men in her orbit, these words were a potent siren song. She found herself staring at the phone, her thumb hovering over the call button, aching to believe that her love had finally been the catalyst for his transformation. Leo, meanwhile, was the silence between the notes. He appeared every Tuesday and Thursday with containers of slow-simmered stews and fresh bread from his bistro. He never asked about Kaylin, and he never asked for a place in her bed. He simply sat on the floor and helped her assemble baby furniture, his large, scarred hands moving with a gentleness that Kaylin's surgeon hands had never mastered. One evening, as they sat in the dim light of the studio, Leo spoke of the garage back in Kansas. "I used to think that being hidden was the only way to be safe," he said, his voice a low rumble. "But I realized that safety isn't about where you hide. It's about who you don't have to hide from." The clarity Arya sought finally arrived during a supervised visit between Kaylin and Lyra. They were at a public park, the air crisp with the coming of autumn. Kaylin was holding Lyra, laughing as she reached for his glasses. To any passerby, they were the portrait of a perfect, young family. But when Arya mentioned that she was taking on a major project that would require her to travel to the coast once a month, she saw it. The infinitesimal tightening of his jaw, the way his grip on the infant's blanket became just a fraction too firm. It wasn't a blow, but it was the ghost of one. It was the familiar flash of "you are mine to control" that had preceded every fracture in their past. In that moment, Arya realized that Kaylin hadn't changed. He had simply learned to camouflage his cage. She knew then that the divorce couldn't just be a legal filing. It had to be a total spiritual severance. The proceedings were brutal. Kaylin's legal team painted Arya as unstable, citing her troubled childhood in Kansas as evidence that she was projecting her father's sins onto a pillar of the medical community. They used her history with Leo against her, suggesting a long-standing infidelity that had driven Kaylin to his rare outbursts of frustration. Standing in that courtroom, Arya felt the familiar urge to retreat, to go silent, to apologize just to make the noise stop. But then she looked at the photos of Lyra in her lap, the bright, wide eyes that had never yet seen a hand raised in anger, and she found a voice she didn't know she possessed. She didn't fight him with anger. She fought him with the truth. She presented the logs she had kept, the photos of the bruises he thought she'd forgotten, and the testimony of the few friends who had seen behind the curtain. When the judge finally granted the decree, Kaylin didn't look at her with love or even regret. He looked at her with the cold, calculating eyes of a man who had lost a possession. It was the most terrifying and liberating look she had ever received. The years that followed were a slow building of a new architecture. Arya's firm flourished, not because she was the most ambitious designer in Silveridge, but because she built with empathy. She designed shelters that felt like homes and homes that felt like sanctuaries. Lyra grew up in a world of stability, her life a tapestry of school plays, messy art projects, and the steady presence of Uncle Leo, who eventually became much more. Arya and Leo's relationship didn't start with a spark. It started with a foundation. There were no naked truths traded on rooftops, only the quiet honesty of daily life. They moved to a house on the outskirts of the city, where the plains of the horizon reminded her of Kansas, but without the fear. On a warm summer evening, Arya stood on her porch, watching Leo teach Lyra how to plant a garden. The girl's hands were covered in dirt, her laughter ringing out across the fields. Arya realized that for her entire life, she had thought that breaking the cycle meant making sure the bad things didn't happen. She finally understood that it actually meant making sure the good things were allowed to grow. She walked down the steps, her bare feet pressing into the grass, and joined them in the sun. The storm had passed, the ruins had been cleared, and in their place, she had built something that could finally weather the wind. The cycle was not just broken. It was replaced by a new legacy, one of peace, one of choice, and one that finally belonged to her.